Yeah. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I would love to introduce you to Shravan Shankar. He's been a friend, a mentor, and the project that is happening here is basically because he's played an instrumental role in making this possible. And the revival of the Earth Circle goes solely to his support, I would say. And I'm really also fortunate and grateful for him to, be a part of this and agreeing to come and meet the first ever cohort of this the Threads of Change program. I'll just quickly, briefly introduce you all to him. He is the co-founder of Climate, and it is a platform that makes capital, the resources, more accessible for climate tech startups. And he will be talking to you about more about that, as well as his own personal journey. And there are a lot of interesting conversations that are planned. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Shravan.
Thank you, Nehal. Really, thanks for the invitation. I really like what you're doing and what you're trying to do as part of Threads of Change. So, hi everyone. Really excited to have this chat with you. And oh, sorry, I have to share my screen. My apologies. I will start on that. Nehal, could you just enable sharing? Okay, got it. So, 1 second.
Okay.
Yes, I am good to share. Okay. It's visible for everyone. Yep. Okay, cool. Yes, so as Nehal mentioned, I'm Shravan. I have been doing a lot of stuff around the sustainability space. I have a presentation here which could be basically quite a lot of information. So, and Nehal mentioned that you guys had a very fun and exciting program yesterday. So, I think that's something we should try and achieve and keep in some way. So the way I thought we could do today's program was when I was talking to Nehal about what I should do in this space, today's session, we thought it'll be useful to also hear a lot from you. So while I'll start off with a talk, which will really be about my perspectives, how I have worked in this space, and how I see this whole area of what we call sustainability action and how that happens. I think the more important thing is to really listen to all of you and give all of you the space to give your perspectives, your views, and your thoughts on this. So we're quite loose with the time today because we only planned it for about an hour and a half, even though it's a 2 hour session. But let's try and see if we're having a nice in-depth conversation on things. Let's spend time on that because I think the most important thing is all of you are able to give your perspectives, give your thoughts, ask your clarifications and questions. Okay. So I'm going to start with my little talk lecture part of it. And I'm going to start with what I do and how I've got to working in sustainability. And if you're part of this program, I'm taking some assumptions. I think the main assumption is all of you understand what we mean by sustainability, at least in a broad sense. Because when it comes to each of our work, how we interact, how we live, we may have different ideas on what sustainability actually means. It's most likely that all your ideas about this are correct because it's all about matter of perspective and how we engage. But I'm going to tell you how I have viewed sustainability, how I work on it. And the talk today is really going to be about how I see what we can do in sustainability. Okay. So Nehal very kindly mentioned about what I do. It's I've firstly been working in this space for quite a long time, so that's why there's a lot of bullet points here, which I'm not going to get too much into. But briefly, what I do today is I run a company called Climate, and the 1 second, Nehal, there's a couple of people in the waiting room, by the way, if you want to include them.
Yes, yes, I'm looking to that.
Okay, yeah. So I run a company called Climate, and it's something which works in the space called climate finance. You may have heard about it. You may not have heard about it, but very briefly, um, if we are to really get more action happening in this space, get more solutions implemented, get more people access to climate and sustainability solutions, we're going to need money. We're going to need money to invest in solutions to become more affordable for people. We're going to need money to make people to be able to buy things. We need money for a lot of things. So I work in this space. And me working in this space is sort of like the culmination of working across the last 15, 16 years in many areas around sustainability, which is what I'll take you through also a bit today. Okay. So this is briefly what we do. It's just a lot of words and languages. It says a lot of things, but I think in brief, it's something that I really enjoy because one of the things that when I started working in sustainability was that I wanted to always make sure that I'm doing something. I wanted to have the opportunity to do something that is new, something that helps to create a path, and something that helps others to actually follow a path in some way. And that's the opportunity I get to do with the work that I do. Um, we work a lot with different types of investors. We work a lot with different types of stakeholders. And mainly, a lot of our role is to really tell them, why aren't you working in sustainability and climate? Why aren't you contributing more to the space? Because it is A, the biggest need of our time, and B, it's also a huge opportunity. So this is like the brief of how we actually go about speaking to people, but doing that requires a lot of in-depth work and what we do. Now, if you look at this, you may see that this covers quite a few different activities, actually. We do a lot of research work, and research is super important in what we do. That's because a lot of the work space that we are working in is very new, and very few people actually have a clear idea on what it means very holistically. So we do a lot of research to sort of bring a lot of sense, bring knowledge, and bring connections to people. Okay, so anyway, you can always ask me any questions later on the Q&A. I'm not going to spend too much of time on this. But this is how I started. So my idea of working in sustainability was really came to me at the age of 14, and it was not a straight path at all. So I ended up doing a lot of very different things, which I'll cover a bit later. But one of the things I learned is that it's totally fine to go on like very wild, very different paths, because a lot of these things is really about finding your space and finding what really works for you and finding what actually makes sense to actually be able to have whatever purpose or impact that you're working towards. So my purpose and my aim was always focused on this idea of how do we make sustainability mainstream. Today, we treat sustainability as something which is so new. It's like an add on, it's like an addition to our normal course of life. But if you really think about it, what are we asking for? We're asking for, can we live in a healthy world? Can we live in conditions that don't affect us? Can we live in a way that our food is grown properly, we eat properly? Can we live in a place wherein everyone has access to, resources and energies that just for us to do the basic things? It really should be very basic. But the problem is, given of how the world works and how basically money tends to drive a lot of these things of our choices, we end up finding that it's not as easy as we would think. It makes sense from a common sense perspective, but a lot of the world does not really work on a common sense space. You might have seen yesterday we had the US elections and a very weird result. That was not really common sense. So this is the example of the sort of world we live in where probably the most important decision that can affect global things was completely nonsensical. But it's the world we live in, and we have to figure things out. And another thing, I'm probably jumping the gun right now, is that one of the things that really comes a lot to a lot of people I speak to who are not in the climate space, who are not in the sustainability space, is them asking me that this seems very difficult to do. And it is difficult because for a lot of times, if you're trying to tell someone that, you should go for an electric vehicle instead of using a diesel or petrol vehicle, even though it's more expensive, it's not as widespread. It's very hard to travel like from, like, say, Mumbai to Delhi, but which you can easily do with a car because you don't have charging stations and all that. It is still something that has a lot of barriers for it. But being able to work in this space which you feel and which you know is sort of really creating the right choices for you, for society, and for the world is very rewarding. So even though that the pace of adoption and the pace of this change can be a bit slow, I get a lot of satisfaction on the fact that I'm working on something which helps to be part of that solution. And that's a huge thing that I take away. We're going to talk a bit about this word of climate anxiety, and I really want to hear from all of you because I'm going to give perspectives that I've heard from youth around this space. And one of the things that I've realized over the last few years is that because of being active towards this, and I'll also give you examples of how I've seen other people working in related areas to what I do. The ability to work towards positive impact is very rewarding when you think about how do we deal with anxiety. Okay. But yeah, brief takeaway from this thing is that you may find yourself being on very unconventional paths. It may be very not straightforward paths. You may find yourself doing things that don't really make sense today for what you're doing. But everything that you do is part of building your experience. And that was the biggest value benefit that I found for doing sustainability. Because until maybe about 5 years ago, I think I always felt that I was not creating the impact that I wanted to create, even though I had been working in sustainability for 12 years. And I felt there was zero impact that I was really doing. But then I could draw a lot, especially what I've done in the last 5 years. I've been able to draw a lot from what I did before that. I'm jumping the gun ahead, but I'll kind of take you through what I mean by this. So the reason I got really interested into sustainability and decided to make it my career for life at the age of 14 was that I grew up like about maybe an hour away from these two places. And this is in a country called Malaysia. I think all of you know Malaysia. And that's where I grew up as a kid. And I was 1 hour away from these beautiful rainforests, which are pristine. And when you hear stories about, even in Malaysia, stories about logging and chopping down trees, to be able to touch like a forest which has been there for 2 million years, it's amazing. It really makes a huge imprint on you and it makes you realize the immensity of time and really how do you preserve things. The other thing which really stuck with me as a kid was something which is an hour away in the opposite direction from this rainforest, which is a firefly sanctuary. And this was one of the most magical places I've ever seen in my life. Because if you've ever, I don't know how many of you have seen fireflies. I'm sure in the Northeast, especially, there's a lot of firefly places. But this was a swampy area around a river where you had to go to this place at night to see it. And I remember when I was ever since the age of about 8, this would be my whenever my parents used to ask where should we go for a break, I'll always say this place. They'll get very annoyed with me because they won't go to any other new places. But the idea of going down a dark river with no lights, and when you turn a bend and then you see these millions of little yellow dots just lining your entire view, is an amazing sight. But then I learned that this is one of the few places in the world where this exists because all its other habitats have been destroyed and been lost. And another thing which really had a big imprint in my mind was in 2004, there was a huge tsunami which happened in December 26th. And in Malaysia, where I lived, it was very close to where we got affected. I'm from Chennai in India, and Chennai also very badly affected. And the loss and the damage that we could see, and as a 16-year-old trying to help in volunteering efforts and doing what little you can, a lot of these things really, spark the thought of why I wanted to get into this. So one of the things I'll be really interested to understand from you, all of you in the Q&A especially, is that what has made you interested to be part of this? What drives you? Like for me, it came from a place of the threat and the potential of these things being lost. And this is how I decided to make it. But there can also be positive ways in why people actually enter the space. I work a lot with startups, and most startups that I meet, they look at the space as a place of opportunity and they're so excited by the potential of it. It doesn't have to be a depressing and sad tale like what I just told you, for example. But anyway, this is what really made me started to look about this space at the age of 14. And this is the question that I've been working my entire life for. How do we make sustainability mainstream? How do we make it accessible to everyone and accessible to whoever needs. So how do you make it the norm, basically? Now, we all are familiar with the SDGs, and this is something which is very comprehensive. Before 2015, we never had something which was so comprehensive, which talks about how do we improve ourselves from a social perspective, how do we improve things from an economic perspective, from an environmental perspective, how do we look at disadvantaged groups and communities, how do we create access to things and peoples who do not have access to things, how do we even give representation to environment, which is something which we have been so terrible at doing. And this is a really interesting way to think about how this world could be mainstream, how sustainability could be mainstream. So all the work that I've been doing has touched upon one of these different 17 different goals in some way or the other. And this is what we keep working ourselves into and for. So this weird chart that you saw that I'd shown you earlier, these are the different things that I was doing in that time. I've worked as a researcher, I've worked in policy, I've worked as what's called an ecosystem and enabler, which honestly, the biggest lesson I got from that is that you can call it whatever you want and you can make up things, which is great because no one is ever going to question you. And, it's not like a proper job title and no one's ever going to question you, but you can always say that, oh, I'm working with a lot of people. But I did find it as a great, that specific activity, I found it as a really important and useful role in building community. And community is something, when I spoke to Nehal, I think it's something that I've always underestimated a lot initially, but now I see the real value of it. And it's a great space to really create a lot of things around access, which we cannot get in many other ways. But I'm digressing, and I've basically done a lot of things, in the last 2009, 16 years or so. And all of these things and what I do right now, and I worked across in different countries, in Europe, in US, a lot in Asia. I love working in Asia because one of the things that I realized was very different from other places is in Asia, it's one of the places where we have the ability for solutions to come from the ground up. The local person in a village, local rural grassroots solutions, they don't wait for a technology or a type of solution to come, they make it happen. And that is super important and super necessary because one of the key things is that when we look at taking sustainability action, it is very localized. It has to relate to how does it affect the individual in a different setting and in different place. That's a very different perspective when you look at, and a big reason for that really is the infrastructure we have is not the best in the world. If you think about how waste gets wasted so badly, how water systems are so poor and everything, it forces people to find solutions on their own. That's a very different case from what you see in a Europe or in US, wherein you have infrastructure and built systems in place. And a lot of the solutions focuses around just how do you build the next big technology to get implemented. One of the things that I believe is that, especially in Asia, we're great when it comes to resilience. We know a lot of our solutions really come from a place of we don't have an option, but we can't just not do anything. So, how do we actually end up doing something? So, I spend most of my time working in Asia, and I think it is one of the most interesting places to definitely work in because you have a diversity of options. In India, for example, you can talk to people who are working on like the highest, most in-depth, deep tech stuff like nuclear fusion and rockets and crazy things like that. But at the same time, you'll see amazing implementation happening on nature and how do you preserve nature and how do you actually make agriculture more effective and how do you actually use traditional means to create large big solutions and make it available. So this is I've had the benefit of having a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of learning and understanding, which is also something I've been able to use in the work that I do. When all these 16 years of my work has come to what I do with climate, and in terms, somehow, this weird mix that I was doing here, all of these things actually are relevant for me in what I do. So I'll always encourage people to not, sorry, what I would say is that taking unconventional paths is actually could be really useful for everyone, could be really useful for you as well. And it's not something that you should be discounted from. But at the same time, I will say I got very lucky. So what worked for me may not work for everyone else. I, for example, came at a point of time where sustainability was very new, very nascent, and was not something that was well established. Okay. So anyway, that's enough about me. I want to spend a bit of time introducing to you around what is sustainability like in Asia, mainly in South Asia and India, where I think most of us are from. And I also want to talk about how we look at taking action in sustainability. That's really what I really want to talk about. Okay. So, one of the things when we look at sustainability, and this is one of the big problems that we see, is that we think the same types of solutions can work anywhere, regardless of where we are. And that's not really true because the nature of different climatic regions and different type of socioeconomic regions, they are the things that actually influence what we can do, what we can access, and what can be actually delivered. So this, for example, is just taking like this climatic region, which affects, for example, the need for us to either have heating or cooling, on how significantly heat waves may affect us, on how glacial melt will affect water availability for us in the future. There's a whole bunch of things around this that ultimately has a significant impact on how, where, what the sort of regions that we are in and the geographic conditions actually affect us. The takeaway from this is that Asia is super diverse because it's obviously the biggest continent in the world. But besides from that, it helps to bring about a lot of interesting diversity. And diversity is something where I feel, especially from an Asian context, is something which is completely unique to us. And it's not just the fact that because we're the largest uh, group geographic region or group, it's just the nature of people who are here. And it goes back to what I was talking about resilience. It's a very unique thing that we have in Asia. Now, these are just some stats and perspectives for you to get a better sense on what the conditions around, sustainability and climate, mainly from a climate action perspective, how does that actually get influenced by things like socioeconomic conditions and vulnerability? Um, One of the biggest things we don't talk about when you talk about anything on sustainability and climate action is this term of inequality. And this is super important because poor people, low income people, disadvantaged people are the people who are going to face the negative effects first. And they want to have the least ability to access solutions that can actually help them a lot. And most solutions that are developed do not actually benefit them, do not actually go to them. So this is technically the way of the world of how it works very often. And this is also something that we end up seeing as is something that gets missed out significantly. If you look on the chart on the left, for example, which talks about different types of technologies which can reduce emissions, you'll see things like CCUS, which is basically carbon capture solutions, which is just like this super expensive, insane technology solution, which gives no regard towards how accessible it can be made for other people. It can be useful, definitely, because it's about removing carbon dioxide solutions, carbon dioxide from the air. But the problem is, if we focus on things like this, that means we're moving away from giving support to things which can benefit other people. And this is one of the biggest problems that I face in climate finance, wherein we are trying to get people to sort of distribute impact equally according to how people actually face this. And that also requires the distribution of financing. But people like the nice, cool, sexy toy. And very often, this is a big problem that we keep facing over and over again. Um, and in Asia and South Asia, where we live, there are these four big mega trends which influence everything that we do. We know about climate change. We know water is like one of the biggest things. Food is one of the biggest things, and waste is one of the biggest things. So, in my view, these are the four key things which really define a lot of the work around sustainability in what we do. And I think I have to also qualify here that I look at sustainability first from an environmental sustainability perspective, and then I look at it from the social part of sustainability based on how these environmental factors affect people, either in making people, either in how people are negatively affected by it, or how people can be empowered to take action towards it. So I think that's something I should have made a bit more clear before. So, for example, things like education and healthcare, I see it as an outcome of how these things correlate with environment sustainability. And that's just how I work. It's not like a true thing. So here's just some big, nice numbers around how significant something like climate change is in Asia. Um, one of the things about being one of the most emerging countries in the world is that it is one of the powerhouses of the world today compared to other places. And I think all of us have heard about this whole debate between the fact that rich countries were the ones who benefited and led to a lot of climate change impacts for their economic gain and towards our economic disadvantage. So, a lot of things that we are trying to solve for, in the context of how we are being affected in Asia, especially, is very disproportionate to it. But the problem is because there's a lot of emerging countries coming up in Asia, we're also adding to the problem which progressively is happening. So we're stuck in this big debate situation on who's going to be the first entity which is really going to take action. And it basically, I think all of you are familiar, maybe some of you are familiar with this annual UN conference called COP, which happens every year. So COP29 is happening in Baku, which is in Azerbaijan, which is an oil-rich country, fossil fuel-rich country. It's the third fossil fuel-rich country in a row, which is hosting a climate conference of the world, which should tell you all you need to know about how effective it may be, which means it's basically going to be not the best. And that's kind of the way that we are dealing with the world and how all these factors actually end up working. And there's also the other side on how we face risks from climate impact. So extreme weather events which are happening, increased heat waves, these are all consequences that we see. And from this map, as you can see, Asia is smack in the center of most of these impacts which are happening. And this is the place which is going to face most impacts, and something we really have to look out for and figure out. So, yeah. Yeah, and I think we don't need to be talking about temperature because it'll get very depressing otherwise. The world is getting hotter, and every other city is basically getting hotter. And of course, Asia is getting disproportionately affected also with that perspective. So this is all realities that we are facing. And one of the things when I started working in sustainability and climate in 2009 was that we thought these impacts are going to happen 20 years down the line. We didn't think it'll be happening in 2024. We thought it'll be happening around 2034 or 2040. But the same impacts that we're seeing of 6 degrees more higher temperatures in different cities, temperatures regularly crossing 50 degrees, 45 degrees. We didn't think it'll happen now, but it just tells you how rapid the pace of change is. So what is the second huge global sustainability issue that we need to be solving for? I'm going to go a bit faster because I think a lot of these things are quite straightforward and quite aware for a lot of people. But again, it's a lot similar to what we think about climate, that in Asia, we do face a lot of the brunt of water effects, A, because of a lack of access, and also because of our increased significant population. And I think a lot of us live in cities which have these thing called zero water days, which means these are cities where by 2035, there's likely to be no water there. Chennai, where I'm living right now, there was a point of time we had 200 days of no rain, and it led to almost zero water in the entire city. It's a city of 10 million people. It's a reality which we faced like about 4 years ago. Not the greatest thing in the world. Yeah, and one of the things that you'll see about a lot of these things is that I put a slide in each of these 4 areas, some of the risks that are faced by this. And Asia just turns out the worst when it comes to risk. We keep getting screwed over and over on all these risks from all these different things. And it also tells you about the fact of how fragile it is from our perspective. The good thing about this whole aspect is that we are a community, we are like a group of people who are very clear on resilience. So our ability to find solutions is very strong. But then the fact is, as we keep facing more and more, adverse conditions, it will become harder for us to solve for this. Food is another key aspect that I want to talk about. I wanted to hear more from you guys, and I think I've been taking quite a while already. So I'm not going to spend too much of time on this, but let's just say it's pretty much the same as before. So it's not really going to be too much of difference from a context. Waste, again, is a form of consumption. And in Asia, what's been interesting is that, especially from 1980s and 1990s onwards, livelihoods, people have been getting richer, livelihoods have been increasing, but the sort of infrastructure to sort of manage this consumption, which is something which has been an outcome of this greater wealth, is not actually increased at all. So we are facing trash mountains in different places. We're facing conditions wherein 60% of the plastic in the ocean comes from 6 countries, all of which are in Asia. So all of these things ends up becoming the fact, ends up compounding the struggles and the issues that we have. So that was all very depressing, I know, but that's also kind of the reality that we're dealing with as well. Okay. But it's also important for us. But the good thing, and right off the bat, let me kind of put it out there, is that solutions for almost all of these things are in place. And that's a really, really satisfying thing that we have. The problem is a lot of these solutions are not really mainstream. And the big question is, how do we make them mainstream? So before we get into that aspect, one of the things that is good to sort of understand is for all of these issues and causes and effects that we experience, there are solutions that are in place for what we do. This is just a summary, but if you think about climate change, the cause is increased GHG emissions. The effects is, more flooding, extreme weather, rising temperature. We have solutions for all of these things. Climate mitigation is an entire huge field of solutions which focus on the cause part of climate change, and climate adaptation, which I think most of you would have be clear about, is what addresses this side on the effect side of things. Now, the problem we have is we didn't expect these effects to be so drastic so soon. So the type of solutions that we have today on climate adaptation are much more nascent, much more early than what we have in mitigation, and we are playing catch up to a large extent. The good thing is that there are a lot, again, the good thing is that solutions are there. The bad thing is that they're not really getting adopted quickly. But I think the positive is the fact that we know what needs to be done, what can solve these things. So the problem of trying to figure out how we solve it is technically, I would say, a much more easier solution to solve for. But it's not always true, as I've learned in my years of working, because people can be very annoying to deal with. If you take something like food as well, it's the same thing. There's a cause for what causes the issues around food, and there's an effect around unhealthy food, nutrition, food waste, and all these things. And we also have solutions for all of these options as well. So the good thing, and again, I'm reiterating what I said, for all the sustainability solutions that we spoke about, and I didn't do this mapping for the other two because it'll just get very long and quite boring. Is that we know how we actually have to get this solved for. But we still face significant, in terms of the type of solutions, but we face significant problems in how we actually make that happen. And this is one of the most surprising lessons I learned when I started working in sustainability, is that just because there's a solution, it does not mean that it's actually being impacted, and does not mean that its adoption is going to be guaranteed. I'll give you some idea on how this looks like. So this is like an SDG map of Asia, which talks about the progress towards reaching, the 2030 targets for Asia as a continent. And as you can see, it's pretty bad. It's not the greatest that we have here. And this big red bar that you see is actually a negative action. It's a regression, and it's, of course, around climate action. So what this shows is that across the 17 SDGs that we have, and we have some very, you would think are quite easy to understand and implement solutions like zero hunger. We want everyone to be able to access food, quality food in some way to address this. We are even struggling to basically get to that. So we are facing a problem wherein solutions are not getting adopted. Definitely a huge issue for us to figure out. And this is a bit more of a more detailed breakup from that, which does say on how certain indicators, and these are 169 indicators, which talk about which of the 17 goals what the progress in 17 goals are. We can see that a lot of them actually have some positive actions happening, but it's like a very, very small amount. And it's all the green ones, which are slightly on top there that you can see. And they're very low hanging fruit, as we call them. So this is basically the context that we're dealing with in South Asia, wherein solutions are in place, they're not getting adopted. And the big question is, why aren't they getting adopted? And sorry, just to kind of reiterate that a bit more, we have different types of solutions that are in place. We have new technologies which have to come up. We also have certain technologies wherein they're already established, but the whole need is to how understand how do we create access for them. So even the type of solutions we need are very different, and they are so disparate right across this entire spectrum that you can see here. This is something I covered earlier on how solutions are very different. I'm not going to get too much into this. But the point I wanted to make was despite solutions being available, what is missing is that the context of how these solutions should be adopted is missing. Uh, we are not answering these questions effectively enough. We're not answering whether do we know if people are able to take action properly. We're not able to understand beneficiaries, people on the ground, the population of everyone who's there, whether they're actually able to understand whether that what their condition is based against these questions. These are just some sample questions. Um, because these really influence the ability for a solution could be taken by someone and used by someone. It affects the ability for someone in this particular location to be able to proactively take action. It is really these questions which really influence whether we are actually able to do things. We may have things available, but the ability for us to do things is not based on just whether we know whether a solution is available. It depends on whether we have access to that, we have the agency to do something with it, and we have the ability to actually be for that to be relevant to us. And if you kind of take a step back, we can sort of break down these questions across into four what I call intersectionalities, which really starts talking about how sustainability interplays with how we as individuals, as citizens, actually interact with it. There's a very strong mental health aspect. I was talking to you earlier about eco anxiety, which somehow, thankfully, because I feel I'm in this work of being able to work in this space, I'm able to avoid. But then I've spoken to my 15-year-old nephew, and he's completely confused and unsure about what he should do in life. Because once he graduates university, he has no idea how the world is going to work. And eco anxiety is something which is so prevalent amongst the youth, especially because basically I would say the generation after me, but my generation has not been very great either. We have not really done the best job at all in really solving for these issues. And a huge part about the issues around anxiety really comes from about whether people who we are trying to target have agency to do things with these things. And one of the things when I started working in sustainability was that I used to see people making people aware about the negative effects of climate change and about sustainability. And you're telling this to people who had no idea about this before. So now they're scared. But then people don't really follow through and say, okay, this is how you can solve it. So you've just made people aware about something which is super negative, and you're just not telling them what they can do about it. And that's a huge trigger point for people to really then see that I am powerless and I can't do anything. And it's a huge contributing factor towards how this works. But gender is an example of disadvantaged groups, and this is probably the most significant disadvantaged groups that we face. But then, if you kind of look at it, even from income segments and even caste segments at times, it's a huge factor that plays into basically are certain groups of people more disadvantaged in facing the brunts of these impacts or in being able to access these impacts. And this is a huge thing that really keeps getting missed out. And this is for me, one of the biggest unsaid things about sustainability and climate action is the problem of inequality. And inequality is not just a case of whether someone can afford it, it's even whether the type of solution is tailored towards a group which is facing a brunt of things. This is a huge question that we don't really address. When you look at settlements, what we're trying to talk about here is the place where people are based, where they're located from. Does the infrastructure, does the space that they live in or they work in give them resources and access to be able to adopt these things? Because this is a huge aspect on, if a person, say, wants to use an electric vehicle, but then if you don't have the infrastructure available for it in your area, then you're losing out on that ability for being able to access and do this positive social action. A huge problem. And technology is, I think, it's a very loose word, that definition that I've kept here. But fundamentally, I'm more focused on the ability of technology to provide access, to provide knowledge, and to provide, the ability for people to be able to do things. It can be the access to information through the internet towards different types of platforms, apps, and so on. It can also be the ability for people to access like hardware tech, which allows them to do things. It's a very esoteric, very broad-based thing. But here I will focus it more around this aspect around access and knowledge and connection. And this is something which helps to also tie in together a lot of these things. Very often, and quite most of the time, we feel lost, we feel helpless, we feel alone. But the ability to basically, get connected with the community through technology globally, like you guys all are as part of the OML program, is a huge benefit that can actually be rolled out. So this is something that is very understated, is significantly not spoken about, but has a significant impact on whether we're able to make change. These four aspects on how does sustainability interplay with mental health, how does it interplay with gender, with settlements, and with technology. And just a little bit, because the breakout session we've planned for is around this whole topic. There's just some, little numbers and data points around it, which I managed to pick up. But I think it's also important to understand that these are mental health is like a lot of these things is still again about how you personally interact with this. It's a very significant thing, and how a person engages with this is can be in very different ways. I do a program with school kids and also college kids on helping them understand climate change, and we do this sort of games and we do this kind of like activity based activities. And one of the first questions we ask them as a pre-question is, what emotions do you associate with climate change? A lot of people put things like depressed, sad, unsure. We don't have people to say they're happy about it, which is very weird, which I really didn't understand. But then when people talk about happy, they look at it as a form of opportunity. They're not able to express it because we just ask them, what's the emotion you feel? Opportunity is not an emotion, but the opportunity to work on something makes them happy, for example. So um, it is again a very it's a very personal thing on how we look at it, but it's a personal thing that's happening across a huge variety of people, which is why it is almost an epidemic at points, and especially at people between the age of 16 and 25 who are really coming to understand this, who are coming to experience a lot of these things, and are coming to realize that a lot of their future choices are very contingent on how the world is really going to work. Okay. Sustainability and gender again is something that we have spoken about. That's an excellent point, Aditya. You're very correct there, which is still for me the most bizarre and weirdest thing. The idea of how I've seen people like swap notes and discussions on air purifiers, and I just do not get it. Like it's just so bizarre a solution there. Yeah, and just a point on gender, for example, this is something which is very rarely spoken about, because when you think about the idea of, okay, renewable energy is a solution for climate change, you never hear about the gender element. You can't really see where the gender element is there in that. But if you take the idea that renewable energy helps to power your grid, but in rural areas you really don't have great access towards the grid, and you have to have your own private, off-grid solutions for energy, and then you realize that a lot of the people who are working in livelihoods in rural areas are women. Then you realize that something like just providing clean energy access has a very strong gender component, has a very strong group component. These are things which we don't really recognize and which we really understand too much. And again, like I said, gender is probably the most visible, the largest sort of I would say disadvantaged group, for which we really need to be understanding it. But this is something that also cascades in different types of disadvantaged groups. For example, nomads who are pastoral farmers, for example. I've been coming a lot around, wool and in Himachal and everything, which is just an absolutely fascinating space. But they can be considered as a form of a disadvantaged group because they had no contribution towards how the situation is today. But then what they are facing is something they have very little agency to do. It's basically a way of life for them, which is going to be likely eliminated if things are not solved for them. But then they're also disproportionately affected. So this is something which we still do a very bad job about, but it's also something that is still being slowly recognized. It's also something that needs to be kept more top in mind when we take decisions, which governments obviously will not do. And settlements is something like I spoke about earlier, is really what are the resources and infrastructures in urban, rural settlements, regardless of what they are, that allow us to really take action. It's a form of, do we have the resilience to face impacts? Do we have the platform to take further action to come into place? So these things are super critical and super important for us to be able to scale and make multiple significant impact. Very often, you'll see like on a Better Indian, you'll see a story about one person who's completely made their house completely solar and renewables, and wastewater recycling is 100% and everything. And that's just one house. But how do you get it from that one house to say 1,000 people in his colony or his community? It's very hard to do that because the foundation of the settlement they live in is not enough to actually, enable and unlock that aspect. Technology, like I mentioned, is I want you to think of it more from this idea of how does it create access? How does it create knowledge? How does it allow you to create community and connectivity? It's a broad term, but I think this is the more important part that gets missed out a lot because it's the sort of thing that allows you to realize that I can build something based on something I've seen in another place. I'll give you an example. Do you Are you familiar with this type of farming called hydroponic farming, which is basically water, basically systems, control systems, and you're growing crops on water. I have a friend of mine who basically set up one of the largest hydroponic systems, and he learned about this just through YouTube videos of a guy in the US. He had zero clue about it. His dad was really good in just building stuff. And even something as silly as that, watching YouTube videos to figure out, oh, I can do this in India as well, is a form of how technology helps you create access. But then what else can it do further is something that we have to look at. Out of the four intersectionalities, this is the one intersectionality which is purely around, it is not focused on how do we look at it from a problem area. It is an intersectionality from a very solutions oriented angle, and it touches upon all the other things that we've spoken about. Okay. Now, I'm just going to touch very briefly on the role of youth because all of you are youth, and I think people from my age onwards are putting a lot of pressure on you guys to do it. But also at the same time, you guys somehow, I really enjoyed talking with folks at your age because A, you're smarter than me than I was ever at your age. And B, I think the drive that you have, maybe it's forced because you see that there is no option to look at another path or another route, is something which is really commendable. And it's super important for us. And this is something we've been talking about this since the 1980s, at least, telling people that how do we create opportunities for the youth and all that. But something happens to people when they grow slightly older, say the age of 40 and 50, and they kind of get stuck in not wanting to let go of things. This is something really weird I've noticed around a lot of people. So we've done a really bad job on how do we actually create empowerment opportunities for youth to then pick up and scale up really well. So this is something recognition is critically important, and how we then are able to harness this is also super important. Um, I think the idea of communities is something which I think is more interesting from a conversation perspective rather than me talking about it. But for me, the ability to have connections with one of the things which is, I think, kind of taking a step back is one of the things which is most interesting is that the circumstances, the experience of people across the world are starting to get very similar. So a solution or a context that we see in Latin America can be very relatable to us. But also in the same way, a solution that we experience in these places can also be very relatable to us. So again, it comes down to this whole aspect of connectivity, access, and knowledge, which is pretty much the bedrock of which really comes to allowing us to either get the understanding on how do we actually go and do something, maybe give us the confidence to be able to do something because we're able to point out and say that, hey, there's someone there I'm seeing who's doing it in a different continent. I can even connect with that person to try and get something done. So this is something which is, I think it's, like I said, I think it's more interesting to understand, and it's part of the breakout session that I have in mind, that to understand on how you think this could be used, what would you expect from a community like this? But it's something which is also very broad based, that it can be defined in many ways. It can be mission focused or purpose focused. It can be geographic. It can also be thematic focused. There's many ways to really cut this part of things. So I've been talking a lot, and I'm kind of also losing my voice a bit. But I think what we'll do now is we'll pause for a quick Q&A. I know there are a few questions which have come through the chat, but if anyone has any perspectives, any reflections, anything that you have from what I've spoken about, or any questions, let's take it now. And once we're kind of happy and done with that, then we can move on to the breakouts. Okay, I will start off with Anvita's point, which is one thing that keeps me up at night a lot is the impact of climate change is felt strongly enough among the people. Is if the impact of climate change is felt strongly enough among people who have enough influence to change things that they actually do. That's a really excellent point because I think the problem is people at that level where they can actually influence change, they have ways in which, like, I think the air purifier example for me is perfect in that case, because that becomes a way for people to avoid this very blatant and clear air pollution problem, which is just kind of delaying the inevitable. And instead of that, you're basically using a tool or a crutch which allows you to delay or mitigate that factor in some way. And the fact is, these things are not cheap, they are expensive. So people who are at that level of being able to influence change, they actually also usually have resources to be able to buy useful things to actually allow them to disassociate from the effects of change. You take something like heat waves and cooling. Only 8% of households in India have access to an AC. Do you think everyone in every single policy maker in the state level or central level, 100% has access to an AC? But how do we then create enough urgency for them to recognize that, A, how are you going to make this thing which is going to become a right for people, a basic right for people? How are you going to actually make that accessible to the 92% of the population who cannot afford it? So this is an excellent point. My belief is that I think for a lot of these people, because the effects of climate change, especially, are not that significant I mean, they are significant, but they can be reduced enough that they don't have to really think too much about it. It allows them to make climate change a secondary issue compared to maybe economic growth and increasing this big GDP number, which only influences and helps like one or two big companies who we will not name in this call because Neha will get in trouble then. But this is the kind of the scenario that we work with anyway. Anvita, the second point, could you kind of sort of elaborate a bit about what you're outlining there? I get what you're saying, but I just need to have a bit of a drink of water, so I want to pause a bit. So if you could kind of just share with the group what that question is, I'll then take it up after a drink. Anvita, are you there?
Anvita, if we could speak, it would be more helpful, more interactive. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, I was sort of what I was trying to think or maybe like articulate in my question is that so two there are two levels to sustainability, right? One is like your individually, what can you do to be more sustainable, or how can you be more conscious of the choices that you're making, whether it is in terms of your means of transport or if you want to like just not use the air conditioning or as a woman, for me, another example I can think of is what kind of products I use during my menstrual cycle,
Yeah.
like just random examples, right? So that is something that is in my control completely. So then it's easier for me to make those changes. And
Yeah.
then I do as much as I can in my personal sphere of control and influence. But obviously, that's like super duper limited because
Yeah.
like it's a struggle even for me to be able to influence certain things at my own family or with my own parents.
Yeah.
Because they're like, we've lived like 50 years like this. Why are you coming and like now making a big deal out of this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one aspect of it. But the
Mm.
other the other aspect to that is also that I'm very aware of the fact that like today, if like I say that, hey, you know what, I'm just going to use only public transport to commute everywhere, and a combination of like public transport and walk wherever I don't have access to the metro because I live in Delhi.
Mhm.
It is the kind of like impact I'm going to have is still like insignificant in comparison to like maybe any one celebrity not having a private jet, not using their private jet once. Like
Yeah,
even that is going to be equivalent to like hundreds of thousands of Anvitas just using metro all their lives.
yeah, yeah,
So then I think that gets a little really disheartening, I
yeah,
would say.
yeah.
Or and then when I'm thinking about this project also, um, how is it that um just give me a minute. I'm trying to like figure out
No,
what's
no.
the best way to um yeah, I think it's just that how is it that at an individual level, so one is like where is the balance? Like how do I sell the argument that we all need to be sustainable to anybody when they like come back to me like, hey, you're obviously not talking to one of the celebrities who are flying around in their private jets. Just to
Mm,
take the same example,
mm,
right? And I have no answer to that. And I'm like, yeah, that's a very valid point.
mm.
And if I'm especially looking at it as a at communities at a community level, the people that we will be working with are also people who are the most affected by climate change or
Yeah,
the most affected by a lack of sustainable practices,
yeah,
but also the ones who are least in the
yeah.
power influence scale.
And
So
also least likely to have contributed to the problem as well.
yeah, and of course, like these likely to have contributed to the problem. So yeah, I don't know if I'm just like rambling or if you're able to,
No, 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 no. It's a
if this
very
context helps.
no, no. It's a very pertinent point, and I think it's an excellent point. Um, the problem, see, I think in a sense, if things were more fair, uh, corporates being held up to account should absolutely be the way things happen. Um, it's a bit of a so it's kind of a weird, difficult thing to decide how it works effectively. Like our
Sorry,
ability.
can I
Yes, please.
just add one more point?
Yes,
Sorry
please.
to interrupt you.
No, no, no,
It's
please.
just like right now in my line of work, also, I work in a space where I'm positioned actually to be able to hold corporates accountable for some
Okay,
of the actions that they're taking.
okay,
My line of work is in waste management, just to contextualize for everybody. And with waste management, I work with an organization that um, actively tries to enable corporates to fulfill their extended producer responsibilities for e-waste and plastic
sure.
waste and things like that. So we are
Yeah,
actually I so we are so I am actually positioned in a place to be able to like hold accountability for the people who have the influence and the power and all. And
yeah,
every single day, I am not exaggerating.
yeah,
Every single day, the conversations I have is just like, oh, but this is costing so much money. It's eating into our profits. We
yeah,
not in they won't say it is eating into our profits. I was like, this is costing so much money. We absolutely cannot afford this. Who is
yeah,
going to pay for this? Who's
yeah,
going to you know what, like if we how do we like now, okay, fine. So we really have to figure out how do you like pay charge the consumer for this again.
yeah,
Because like I mean, and then I'm like, I can't say it, but what I'm thinking is like just look at how much margins you have at every stage and how much buffers you have at every stage. You can if you
yeah,
just like cut down on that like by 1%, it's gonna be enough to like
yeah.
do a lot of things.
You're right. Yeah.
So I think that's a very rampant pain point also for me. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. And now I will let you go on and respond. Thank you.
Okay. No, but thank you so much for sharing, Anvita, because the I mean, the one thing for sure is that corporates have a lot of leeway in the ability for us to keep corporates into account is very minimal, frankly speaking, because if you really look at how things work, especially in an Indian context, the crutch that's always used is that I'm complying with the law. I am following things that are expected of me. Beyond that, anything I do is voluntary. Now, this whole idea of being where for them to understand that being accountable goes beyond basic compliance is something that doesn't come into their whole perspective. Um, the other thing that corporates have done very sneakily of as well is to put the onus of change, the onus of responsible behavior on the individual, on the consumer. Take the idea of a carbon footprint. That was something came up which BP, British Petroleum, came up with to basically pass the buck of them needing to reduce their overall footprint, which is absolutely huge, and say that you as the individual are empowered by measuring your own footprint. You will be empowered to take the decisions that you have to take to actually live, let's call it a more low carbon lifestyle or whatever. So there is an element where, I mean, you come from a practical perspective. If you have the agency, you have the resources to basically, for example, avoid things which a corporate which does not follow from these norms to take up, you can do that. But I recognize that that's only available for very few people to actually do. Um, the biggest frustration we absolutely all of us will face is the fact that even though we hold ourselves to account to follow like proper practices, like I'm not going to do food delivery, I'm not going to buy plastic products and all and so on. It may feel definitely like it's only a few of us doing it, but that's also kind of the reason it's quite important for communities to also come together and find themselves as well. The problem, at least in India, from a very practical perspective, is that corporates only move if compliance and laws force them to move. Something like EPR that you mentioned about, it's really, it's basically the only reason it's really picked up is basically government has actually put penalties and non-compliances on people, on companies which have actually not taken it up. Now that threat has been there. So that's why they've actually ended up taking up and, trying to do something. But like you exactly mentioned in your case, it's very much the letter of what will the law allow them to do. So this is kind of the problem that we face. Like, how do we actually get corporates to actually move with taking action as it should be versus just doing what is expected from them from a legal perspective, because that's how they basically operate and work. When you talk about the balance, I think from an individual perspective, I would say because we can only change as much as what we have access to make something change, which means do we have access to the resources that allow us, and are we able to actually afford those sort of resources that will allow us to basically shift and live, say, a more sustainable life or a low carbon life and so on. If we don't have access to those solutions, then we are stuck. Absolutely, there is not much option for us to really take up and do some way of change. But what we've also seen is that that ends up manifesting in other different ways. So people can then use that crutch as a way of saying that, okay, can I do something about it because I want to do something about it? Because it is a form of not, it comes down to this whole point of, do I feel helpless in being able to do any action, or can I actually do something about it? It's unfortunately a question where I don't think it's easy for us to balance, because it ultimately comes down to how do we as an individual come to terms and basically come to accept to some sort of what do you call it, rationalization on how we actually balance between these two things. But the odds are definitely skewed towards us. The impact and the focus is placed towards us. Media pieces talk about how individuals are doing all these little changes in some way, but then it's not easy for millions of other people to then take it up. But if a corporate actually helped to enable that change, then millions of people can do it. But that doesn't happen. So it's not a great answer, I know, but it's also something that it ultimately, I think, comes down to how do we rationalize against that context. But thank you very much for your question and your point. I think it's super important, and I think it's just super critical. Yes, Aditya, you have your hand. Yeah.
I just want to add something to like Anvita said, also sort of trying to give an answer. The way I have seen these businesses work is even if anyone has seen Shark Tank here, there was
Yeah.
one episode I was watching, and in that the business told them about the entire revenue they had for a year, and that was around 10 crores. And
Mm.
year before that, they were at 9 crores or something.
Mm.
So investors were very shocked that you only had there was no growth in the 2 years of your business. You did 9 crores, now you're doing 10 crores. But when you actually look at that number, it is actually a good number. It's not
Yeah.
that it is financially very bad.
Yeah.
Just because you are not having that 2x 3x growth does not mean your business is bad. And that is also somehow then this mentality becomes for
Yeah.
all these corporate houses that they have to keep on growing, they have to keep on expanding, having like more money in, then they
Yeah.
spend more on the marketing, basically then it all becomes a cycle.
Yeah.
And partly we are also responsible for it, because in the broader terms, each and every one of us do invest our money in these companies through mutual funds, stock markets, or in some through some channels.
Yeah.
And when we invest that, they are then sort of compelled to make more profits so they can show growth,
Yeah.
in turn increasing the stock price or keeping it very high.
Yeah.
If it was not an incentive for them, I don't think they would even care to have a lot of like growth every year per se.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, the broader terms, I feel everyone is responsible, but then these corporate companies or big multinational companies also tries to put that on individual people that you are buying plastic, so you are doing wrong. You are taking a cab instead of a public transport, so it's your fault.
Yeah.
Just try to shift the blame, which is also again wrong. So
Correct. Correct. So I think one of the things when I worked in policy, I think one of the problems that I wouldn't say a problem, but one of the things you end up recognizing is that policymakers, why they use the GDP number as like the main target to address, regardless of everything. Why companies talk about all of these things is because they use this whole spiel that this is how we actually improve livelihoods, how we create greater employment, how we move the country from a low income to a medium income, base. But the fallacy of that whole thing is that generally most of this money is very unequally distributed. But the problem is that companies end up saying that the reason I need to be like a fast growing company and so on, and why India says I need 8% growth, is that they say, oh, this is the way that we'll get 100 million people to actually have better incomes and better livelihoods. But then the thing which they conveniently avoid is that that gets pooled in very small specific places. It doesn't spread around to many people. And like Prachi says, forget about even climate justice and just the idea of having just transition, just the idea of justice and really spreading it towards a way wherein it's actual proper equity is just completely lacking in most places. Especially so, it's a bit more acute in emerging developing countries because it's this sort of like narrative that they're able to use to say that because there's a whole bunch of people who, say, for example, have to be moved from seasonal agricultural labor towards something which is more consistent and salaried and so on. They can keep pointing towards the fact that I'm going to maximize profits and maximize revenue and so on, because through some magic box which is never explained, because that's not really the case, they'll say that at some point of time it's going to benefit a huge amount of the population because they'll then get these same jobs. But that's such a fallacy when you see unemployment rates going up, people not being able to get access to these things. But what you said is also very true. It's This is unfortunately a very raw deal that we are faced with on because for a lot of these people, the economic system that we are in is so skewed and it's so narrow towards just benefiting one metric, which is like how much of wealth are you creating. That's like, and the problem is there's more than enough people to basically back and support that. And it's a huge fallacy. It's a huge problem. But you're very correct also with this whole point. Like, your MF fund is basic. You may not want to support a company, but you invest in a mutual fund, you're basically backing a company which is probably going against what your principles are. But how much of influence can you have on those things? But No, but thanks for your points, both of you. Really, really good points. Yeah. Has anyone else got any perspectives they'd like to share?
Yeah, Shravan, Nitin has texted on the group.
Okay.
It's kind of a statement.
Yeah.
There are other marginalized gender identities, including trans and non-binary individuals,
Yeah.
which are affected disproportionately. They are often not brought into conversation.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And the and this is, I think, one of the realizations when I started getting into sustainability, and I first thought it's all about, oh, you just need to get technology adopted and implemented. And you realize like it's such a 1% mentality sort of thing, because you're then only mainly benefiting a very small part of the population and a very small let's see, elite of people who can actually afford and access these things. This is something we're very convenient to also forget and ignore in our entire discourse of things. We just do not, we do such a bad job, and I think this is kind of a global problem, frankly. I wouldn't just point it as an India problem on its own. We do such a bad job on figuring out how do we actually effectively support and work with marginalized groups. We just are not able to, because for people, especially who are in power, people just unwilling to basically even relinquish a bit of that. Like even when you kind of look at the idea of get people trying to think of, can we give proper representation for disadvantaged groups in positions of decision making, you'll start seeing that there are so many barriers and strings tied to that statement that either you're getting a person who already is from that group but then thinks like them, or if a person really wants to take action, they are not able to actually act in the way that they want to act. So it's I'm sure my the word is escaping me, but you're you're stuck in a particular system which is already designed by someone else and which does not allow you to actually pick it up further. Yeah, Prachi, we'll just take your question and then afterwards we'll go to the breakout.
Yeah, so I think because the whole conversation is really insightful and a lot of thoughts are passing through my head, like I have a lot to say, but I think the most important thing that comes up right now is the paradox between the urgency to come up with solutions and the contrast between the feasibility of those solutions. Because how do we make them more accessible? How do we take in account the diversities of the people that we are, that are affected by climate change? And in general, how do we acknowledge the vast differences between the experiences of people? Because but I work with people who are never affected by any huge casualties. Like I have never seen the people who I work with go through terrible tsunamis or any life changing calamities. And then there are these people, but then at the same time there are people who are facing terrors every day, or it's just a part of their everyday life. So this whole paradox, because I think about climate action and then there are 10 things that I want to work on simultaneously.
Yeah, I completely get your point.
And there's people who are being affected by it. There are genders that are not being included. There's gender inequality, and a lot sits on your back. And then coming to the mental health point, because as a neurodivergent person, life is already very hard on me.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then to solutions and actions, and how do we make our contribution to it?
yeah. No, that's such a good point, and I think I mean, at least the way I've always thought about our ability, especially in this point, and that whole thing you mentioned about, once you start getting immersed and you're like, there are 10 different things that you can do, and you're trying to figure out, okay, which is the one to take up. I think the way that I've always seen what we can do about that, I've always been very bad at that. I think let me start off with that, because I'll do like six different things and realize I'm burnt out, and then I'll take a step back, and through a very painful process, I'll figure out like one or two things to do. I definitely will not encourage whatever I've done for this, but it's also a lesson that we can't always do everything. Uh, there are ways in which we can go around to navigate this. So, for example, if you are able to kind of, I mean, and in some aspects, the level of participation that you have in different things can be varied. You don't have to necessarily give the same level of participation level in all these 10 different things that you want to do. And for me, that's, I think, the beauty of being also connected to a community, which can actually help to unlock a lot of these things. Because the moment you come in through, especially a community which is strongly aligned from a values perspective, you're very likely to find a lot of affinity with people who are doing a lot of the things which are parallel to what you're doing. So um, I think for me, this whole aspect on the level of how you can engage can vary, and it's probably a way of really making best value out of the limited time and the fact that you're just one person and you're not 10 different people who can do 10 different things. Um, that is probably the most effective way you can do it, because you're still a contributor to whatever that thing is. You can still direct and you can still align to a lot of these things, but you don't have to take most of the brunt of how something gets implemented. And I think any structure which allows you to do that is what can really provide a lot of, you know, solace for you to get connected with it. Because, like, for example, take for example this group. I really have enjoyed what you guys have done. I'll be more than happy to, keep contributing and getting back to you guys if you have any questions in whatever you guys are doing. I'll be super happy for that. Now, that's my way of being part of something which I will not have been able to. This is super interesting. This is something I really like, but I know I don't have the time and the bandwidth, or I am not the best person to actually do most of the legwork, but I can still contribute towards it. So that's the benefit of what structures like this can offer. And I think another just larger point that I'd like to definitely point out is that and I think goes back to Anvita's point on the sense of disillusionment we can feel about the fact that we may be doing our all, but the pace of things around us, the pace of people even who we directly work with, can be so limited and so limiting in what we can do. Um, it goes back to how we are able to figure out some threads of positivity towards what we're doing. Maybe in some way it's not the greatest option, because in some way you're compromising your ideal of what the sort of impact you want to do to a form where you're now saying, they may not get it 50%, but at least 20% of the conversation is that. Like in the EPR case, he's talking about it's kind of a messed up system. I think most people who work in EPR kind of recognize the how certain companies actually are not the most sincere in how they do it. But there is still some action which is happening. You are getting, value chains being built out. There's less leakage happening. There is some positivity which is happening towards that. The hope is that it doesn't just stay at that level. It keeps increasing and scaling and growing. But it's but I think the biggest lesson I've always learned is finding your tribe is probably the best thing that you can find. Because if all of you are sad, at least you're not sad on your own. You have other people who can sort of take the brunt with you. It took me a long time to find my tribe. I took a very, very long time to find that sort of a tribe. I'm really glad, like right now, there are a few groups of people who I can go to, and even if I'm not feeling the greatest, I know there's affinity there, and there is some form of agency that can even come through with it. So that's probably one, and that's why I'm actually really glad Nehal told me to kind of touch upon this idea of like global community networks for youth, because for me that's another word for tribe. What exactly is the tribe that you can lean on? Yes, Nehal, sorry, over to you. I've been rambling a lot.
Uh, thank you, Shravan. You can have your other sip of water now. I mean, yeah, but thank you so much for the insights. And I mean, due to the uh, time we have, is it okay if we extend, like, this is out to everyone? Is it okay if we extend like 10 to 15 minutes more? Because I think the next step, where we break into different rooms, like Shravan mentioned, is going to be really interesting for you guys to kind of talk deeper. And I know Amsang also has a comment
Yeah.
on the chat, why no action to those people who illegally dump waste on forest areas. I think this can also be taken in the breakout
Yeah.
room, and we can take it from there. Is that okay, Amsang? Okay. So moving on, before we uh, Okay, Nitin. Before, thank you for informing. Before we go into the breakout rooms, before we start a conversation on these, there are these four topics that Shravan had mentioned. Maybe just introduce yourself slightly with everyone because you guys are all meeting, most of you are meeting for the first time. So just a humble request, and we will come in one by one. We have, I'm giving you about 10 minutes to be in this room, and maybe we can converge after that. Okay.
Just give me one
So,
second. I've got some pointers that you guys can
oh yeah.
uh, kind of follow. What I'll do is I will also kind of put this on the chat, I think. And then we can also, Manju, can we take your point after we come back? Because after the breakouts, we'll have a sharing session. So we can also take it up then. Okay. So if you maybe take a screenshot of this, or so that at least you all have these things. These are just like some suggested areas that you can talk about after you introduce yourselves, but kind of see how the conversation goes. Make sure everyone has like, you know, everyone has a voice to say and a voice to speak. But we just wanted to, just very curious to get your perspectives on how you interact with the intersectionality that your group is focusing on.
Okay. So please take a screenshot of the screen, and we'll just move ahead. Okay. Three, two, one, go. Over. Let's.
Sure. I think we can leave it to the teams to share, to discuss a bit about what they spoke about, what they shared. And whoever wants to go first, please go ahead. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll do the. Okay, good. Aditya, I think you are.
Me and Lavanya were talking about sustainability and settlements.
Okay.
And उसमें like she being from Delhi and me being traveling to Delhi a lot, we were talking about how like the Yamuna River is so polluted that even like the fishes in that, like there are a lot of fishermen dependent on the river, and the fish they sell, they contain a lot of parasites. So there is she knows a place जहाँ पे there is a fish market and fishermen from that area come and sell the fish, and people have stopped buying those because of parasites. क्योंकि the chemical जो होता है उससे it's not also good for the fishes, right?
Yeah.
Because there is very high level of TDS and stuff in that water. So that was a very interesting take ki how climate change affected matlab, like all the things that we are doing to the river. It is
Mm-hmm.
affecting the livelihoods and the settlements because these are like generational fishermen and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to add something, Lavanya?
नो जितना था मतलब इसमें ऑलमोस्ट कवर अप हो गया है। और वो जो पिटिशन वाला पॉइंट था कि मतलब हम लोग घर पे बैठे बैठे साइन अप तो कर देते हैं, बट हमें पता नहीं है उसका कोई एक्शन लिया भी जा रहा है या नहीं।
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks very much. I just have one small point to mention, which is that um, uh, so pollution is not a factor of climate change. It's just a factor of human activity basically not being regulated and managed. But I really like this point because aside from that, I really like this case because it talks about how, people who had this livelihood of being fishermen on the Yamuna. Today, a livelihood is lost. Today, and it's through no fault of their own. And the question then becomes then what next for them? What is the real option that they have? Because a traditional way, and this is also something which goes back to also touches upon tradition, touches upon heritage, and so many other things. That these are very tangible things that is completely getting lost. And if you kind of look at to be honest, I actually still had no idea there were fish in the Yamuna. I thought there was just no more fish, especially in the Delhi stretch of the Yamuna, because you always keep saying about the foam and everything which comes out. So, but it's almost goes back to this point of resilience. Now, if you imagine like a place wherein you're not able to get and sustain food, sustained access to resources for you to actually be able to nourish yourself and live. It's a huge impediment which ends up happening. Today, it's not a big problem that we see it because world is so connected. We get our food from all over the place. It doesn't we don't face the effects very directly. But imagine this continually happening over and over again. This is how we end up. We will face a crunch wherein food security becomes a significant problem, and then it compounds to how it affects livelihoods, how it affects traditional jobs, and what happens to these people. So, thanks for sharing that. One thing is, if anyone else has a perspective that they want to jump into, please do jump in as well. Don't hold back. Okay. Okay. Then someone else and from another group, maybe the mental health or the gender group.
I can go next.
Sure.
So Nishan and I, we talked about our first of all our interest in working for mental health, and then how it connects with climate action and sustainability in general. He shared his experiences from his community, how people are distressed because of the effects of climate change. And then I think it was a really optimistic conversation because we found a lot in common, and we I think every point that each one of us said was backed by one another. And so I think we mostly talked about the importance of how it's important for each individual to work on their mental health, so that that effect can all combine and then make an impact on the overall health of the people. So I think we talked about the importance of how it's the necessity of good mental health support in India, because we lack the resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an additional question I have for the both of you is that what do you feel are a couple of things that, as a community, that can really help to start making a change? Think of a network like what you all are here. Is it about starting to, figure out how you can access resources that could help you in some way? What would be this one or two things that you feel a community could support in just improving the situation based on what you're seeing?
Like, even though we didn't get to this part of the to this part in our conversation, but because it has been an ongoing thought process for me, I think it's very important first to voice out what people are experiencing, because when I started working in the field, I did not know that what I was experiencing was called eco anxiety, because I did have anxiety beforehand. And when it became really hard for me to think of solutions. And for, I guess, the first few months of my project, I was barely doing anything, and I was trying to deny it as much as I can. So what helped was to accept what's going on. And then there were other people who had been working since a long time, who had been in the space that I was in. So I think it helps to reach out for help. It helps to have mentors, and even though they're not equipped in the best way, they still have very useful advice. And you never know. I think it helps to talk as much as you can, because you never know what useful advice you can get from anyone.
Got it.
Nishan, if you would like to add anything.
Yeah. So basically, when we talk about, reaching out to people about our problems, we have to understand one thing, that there's a big chunk of people who reach out because of these interactions right now, but there's a big chunk of people who don't too. Sometimes they don't, even if they have the necessity, people to talk about, talk about their problems, their issues. They just don't. But how can we tackle that itself is, firstly, it should be, I mean, yes, firstly, an individual level of communication is very important. But with that, not only communication, but an individual level of, uh, solutions is important. I mean, highlighting the solutions while talking about it, so that even if they don't reach out, at least they know how to mitigate it or how to, solve it somehow, right?
That's a really good point. That's a very very nice point. I really like that, and that even that getting that sort of like connection is a super important thing. And frankly, the both of you described what a tribe is. Basically, a tribe is there for you. A tribe is someone who is a group of people who basically are there to have your back in some way or the other. And there is the most important thing. There's a value match there, which actually works. So thank you very much. Really enjoy that. The last group on gender. Um, who was in the gender group?
Um, I will have to check.
Okay, okay. In the meantime, Manju, I think before we went to the breakouts, you had something that you wanted to share. Why don't you share that with us?
Yes, actually, I wish to speak, but I guess it's gonna require a lot of time.
Oh, it's fine.
So,
It's just, yeah.
yeah, I just want to, put forward the realistic scenario that is currently ongoing in my hometown, specifically in my village. So, I come from a very, I can say, from a small village in Kalimpong district in West Bengal. So, actually, let me first tell you about the scenario of my village. And yes, Nihal, he has been to my village, and we met back in 2021. Yes. So actually, my village is kind of backward, I must say, in terms of education and in terms of education as well as awareness regarding all of this stuff that we're talking about, sustainability and everything. And now the efforts have been ongoing. Like you can say that Arnav and Vicky, they were in my village. They worked for about, I guess, 2 to 3 years. And after that, there were some issues due to which they had to, that's all another story. So, um, actually, what I'm currently, the main purpose of me joining this fellowship program was that I have a lot of doubts regarding the scenario of my village. So, what is currently happening is there is a government project going on in my village. That is there is this National Highway 717A that's being currently ongoing in my village. So, due to that, as you can see, when we are talking about sustainability and environment and everything, so when there is some project as such, such projects going on, then obviously there will be a lot of harm to the environment. Yes. So first is clearing of the forest, and this will eventually affect the villagers, right? Because the kind of village it was back. I have to say, Nihal, that the kind of village that he saw back in 2021 is really totally different from what we see right now. The kind of change that the project has brought into our village is drastic, I must say. So these are the changes we have been facing on. First, changes, obviously there is change in the environment. The kind of environment or the kind of environment we had back in those days when there were no projects is totally different from that we see now.
Okay.
Second one we can say is about the occupation,
Mm-hmm.
right? We can say about the occupation of the villagers. Back then there was no transportation facilities, there were no transportation facilities, as well as there was not even a good network.
Okay.
So after the coming of the highway, that has drastically changed, and now people are, instead of opting for agriculture, farming, this, yes, instead of opting for agriculture and farming, they are tending to move out of the village in pursuit for a better occupation. That is the thing. Due to which we can say before, what the villagers used to do, they used to cultivate their own crops, they used to cultivate their own food. But right now, there is no such a thing, because most of the people, they are moving towards city for, for better jobs, for better livelihood. So that is one scenario that we are facing. And the next one is about the education system. As we see, there is only one government school in my village. There is only one primary school in my village, and there is effort going on to establish one more secondary school in my village. So that is currently, it's a private school. So in the government school, I went there and I voluntarily worked there. So when I went and saw there were only currently 10 to 15 students there. You can imagine. And there were only two or three teachers. So this is the education system of, I must say, my village, particularly my village. And after that, what we have done is right now, so I talked to Vicky and I also talked to Arnavda. So after we spoke, I started to, I went and I talked with the youths of my village. As you see, when I went and spoke with them, and there were lots of youths who acknowledged this kind of change that was ongoing, and who were trying to, who were, ready to work. Okay, let's do something for our village. We have seen the scenario of our village, and they wanted to do something for their village. So we have collectively come together, all of the youths of my village, and we are, we worked back, and we are still trying to work on the different aspects of our village, maybe towards the education system, maybe towards the environment and sustainability. So we have been trying to work. But as you see that due to less education system, and due to less insights from the educated people, we are still lagging behind. So with my guidance and with my leadership, there are some youths who are trying to work for the change. So I myself, I'm in the, in the learning phase, and I myself do not have that sort of knowledge to go and drive about a drastic change in my village. But I must say, all the youth, we have been trying to do that. So what can we as the youths, what can we do in order to combat this kind of uh, challenges that we are facing now? So that is my kind of question to not only to you, but to everyone that is present in this session.
Okay. No, that's quite I like that example because it talks about how when we talk about settlements and sustainability, you realize that not just one thing is going to solve other opportunities. Like you mentioned the point about the lack of education opportunities, that will have a cascading effect on the type of employment opportunities that are there. It has an effect on the type of other resources and structures that you can find and have in place. The thing is that there's no real easy answer for this to solve this, because in a way, if you look at it, um, the structures that is given from a, like, like an MLA or from a government structure, these are the sort of things that should go towards helping to improve rural areas, especially look to improve settlements and all these things in place. The I think one of the things that ends up becoming a key factor in some way in this is that how do you actually create opportunity for people to actually do more within the space? So I'll give you a bit of a tangential example on this. I spoke earlier about how renewable energy, there was this big push around how do you make renewable energy accessible to rural and rural folk and rural settlements and areas. A big reason was that the grid system, even if today our grid system is mainly with fossil fuel and coal, um, you can create solar panels which are sort of like standalone, which work on their own. So you're getting both access and you're also getting a clean form of energy being generated, which is great both ways. So the initial thought process and the logic was we will just provide these off-grid, it's called off-grid solar panels towards people. People will be able to charge their home, charge like a refrigerator in their home, charge their phones, and all these things. And there were some vague ideas that, oh, if they're farmers, they'll be able to charge their phones. Then they may be able to get information on, crop prices and get better prices. But the second part, beyond just providing energy, providing this form of clean energy, was very an assumption of what people thought, what could happen from it, but no one actually worked and engaged on it. Now, what ended up happening was most of these off-grid solutions, and energy is a great way to look at it because that's like the basis of us being able to do anything today. It's very hard for us to do a lot of things without a form of energy. So the energy basically, most of these off-grids ended up failing. And mainly because people who, even though these were maybe set up free of cost, there is a maintenance to it. And people who did not see an improvement in their livelihoods and their incomes weren't able to actually sustain to maintain that sort of off-grid systems. They didn't have the understanding on how to do it very well. They weren't equipped enough on it, and they couldn't afford to pay people to come from another place to their place and also spend on parts to actually fix it. But what ended up happening then is people took another look at this and saw that, look, the basic problem here is how do you create better livelihood opportunities to people? So you then have this entire movement of what's this, there's a term called PURE, which is productive use renewable energy. And the whole idea is, can you then provide renewable energy attached to something which will help to improve the livelihood or the income of people then? So people started, for example, connecting it with a solar dehydrator, which will allow, instead of food crops going to waste in like 2 weeks because they're not sold, if you dehydrate it, they last for 6 months. And they're considered a value add because it's a different form of a product. It can be used in, ingredients for packaged foods and things like that. It doesn't only go to the mandi. So this then became another way in how people can actually start getting access to energy and also earning a livelihood. Now, because they then started getting this livelihood and this income increase, and there's a company that I work with closely, which works in Maharashtra on this. People, farmers there get 10,000 rupees extra every month just on using the solar dehydrator system. That's about a lakh every year, which they're able to get in additional income. They are then able to then invest it into this microgrid off grid, which can power other things beyond just the dehydrator. And by more and more people doing that, there's just more wealth which comes out from this. So one of the things in really creating an opportunity area around this will come to how can you actually improve the livelihood opportunities of people in your community. That's where it kind of starts from. And then once that ends up getting solved for in ways, then the opportunity will be that, okay, what can happen beyond that? So there's this entire thing called the cultural economy, which includes things from handicrafts to foods to so many things. But the common thing right across it is that people who work in rural places, people who are maybe what do you call it? Individuals who work in they may have small like self-help groups in some way. They're very unstructured types of but they're not unstructured, they're very individual types of people with a craft or with some sort of talent in place. They have the opportunity. It's about how do you really create livelihood opportunities for them to really be able to do more. That's where it really, that is like a good first step that can shape up. It's obviously a more complex question in many ways that you speak about, that you've explained, and thank you for sharing. But this is probably one of the first steps that could be the priority focus, because how do you actually enable people to basically earn more is kind of at the basis of a lot of these things.
I just want to say, like, I mean, the example that you gave, Shravan, it's a really interesting idea, because I would just like to say that Manju's village, Chuikin, is a beautiful, beautiful place. And the idea of the Mohan Collective actually kind of, you would say, originated there. That is when I met Arnav and Vicky for a different project, and we ended up doing something differently because living during the lockdown time over there for 21 days was something that I really think. But coming back to your example, I think you're absolutely right in terms of livelihood. What we realized that is like, the whole landscape that Manju said, that was like, that is changing and has changed from what we saw last to now, is because of the fact that the highway being built, there are more opportunities for hotels, for the roadside economy that is being built. And people are running there, or like, or either over there, or like, for better opportunities outside, and leaving the agricultural landscape very dismal. And Manju has been doing really good work by uh, getting together a lot of young people, like, and that has really, like, I mean, we've seen her work. It's been so long, like, I haven't also met her personally, but just like, you get to know people, like, you get to hear from other people that, okay, because the last time I met Manju, she was studying, and she was also doing on the side, teaching kids, to doing tuitions, this, that. But the conversations I used to have with her, those short conversations in these
Mm.
visits, were always about, like, she wants to do something for her community, something for a village. And it's like a very dismal, back then also very dismal landscape, in terms of, it looked like, literally it's in a valley area. And it looked like the Amazon forest scenario, where, like, trees are being felled, and there are tractors everywhere. And once a week, a tractor would fall down, crash, and, like, break, or like, step on a water pipe, and people used to go, the men particularly used to go look for, like, search for the source of where the water pipe was broken. And you could see that gender disparity also, while the women were kind of, you know going to fetch the water, and we used to go fetch the water with them. Just excuse me for a bit.
You're
So
on
sorry
mute.
about the background noise.
Okay, no
Yeah, yeah.
worries.
So,
Yeah,
anyways, like, in terms of coming back to Manju's story, like, I think, I'm really happy personally that she has applied for this, and uh, and I'm sure, like, there are so many more stories from all of you. Like Aditya, I've been engaged with him since the Omlas journey. Prachi, I've seen her, like, in multiple platforms. And Lavanya, similarly Lavanya, and Nishan is, he's still in school. So, like, I mean, there's so much potential, like, so,
yeah,
in this cohort itself. And I think, thank you so much, Manju, for sharing this. And I know
yeah.
we are way out of, like, have exceeded time, but I think, it didn't feel like that. And I just want to hand it over to Shravan to kind of finally close this, maybe.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's thank you everyone. It's been really nice. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you found some value from whatever I said, and I know I said a lot and I went through a lot of these things. But yeah, I think I was just telling Nehal during the break that this is a super interesting set of folks that I've come across that he's managed to get as part of this fellowship. I'm super interested to see what you guys come out with. And definitely, if there's any way that I can still be of help to any of you, please do reach out. I'll ask Nehal to share my contacts with you all. But thank you so much. I really hope this was useful and all the best for the rest of the fellowship. And yes, I am hoping to be there at the Kesong Festival in December. So if I am there, I'm really looking forward to meeting all of you.
One final thing, can we have like a screenshot? The
Yeah,
Oblast thing, yeah. Manju, Lavanya, if you guys can switch on your videos. Prachi switched off her video. I don't know why. But like, yeah, this is a tradition, something we do usually.
yeah, that makes sense.
Uh, but if you guys are comfortable, okay. Lavanya, are you there? Can you switch on your video? Nishan, he said he can't because his camera is thing. But okay, let's do this. Yeah. Hi, Lavanya. Manju, are you there? Okay. Anyways, we will go forward. Three, two, one, say cheese. Okay. And I like the comment, climate doesn't have time.
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't. It's a true point. But
Yeah.
yeah, thank you everyone. Really appreciated this and all the best.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shravan. Again, I would like to heartily say that you've given so much time, and and I know that you will be continuing this journey with us.
Yeah,
And we would love to see you in the festival.
yeah,
Yeah.
I will definitely be there for that. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. See.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye. See you.
Bye bye.